Okay, this is Maya Angelou. I know why the cage bird sings. All right, we're gonna read from chapter 1 all the way to 7. So this is Reading with Femi, and we're gonna read this book. This book is actually about Maya Angelou's childhood, back in times. It was back in the segregation and all of that. Uh, Certain people of certain color couldn't do certain things. So, but this is about her childhood, growing up with her brother and her families, and how she was raised up in her life. So, we're gonna read this. Trying to find chapter 1. Okay, chapter 1. When I was 3 and Bailey 4, we had arrived in the musty little town wearing tags on our wrists, which instructed to whom it may concern that we were Margaret and Bailey Johnson Jr. from Long Beach, California, en route to Stamps, Arkansas. Mrs. Annie Henderson, our parents had decided to put an end to their calamarous marriage, and father shipped us home to his mother. A porter had been charged with our welfare. He got off the train the next day in Arizona, and our tickets were pinned to my brother's inside coat pocket. I don't remember much of the trip, but after we reached the segregated southern part of the journey, things must have looked up. Who always traveled with loaded lunch boxes, felt sorry for the poor little motherless darlings, and piled us up with cold fried chicken and potato salad. Years later, I've discovered the United States has been crossed thousands of times by frightened black children. Traveling alone to their new affluent parents in northern cities or back to grandmothers in southern towns when the urban north regained on its economy promises. The town reacted to us as its inhabitant had reacted to all things new before our coming. It regarded us a while without curiosity, but with caution, and after we were seen to be harmless, and it closed in around us as a real mother embraces a stranger's child, warmly but not too familiar. We lived with our grandmother and uncle in the rear of the store, which she had owned some 25 years. Early in the century, Mama sold lunches to the sawman in the lumber yard, that's East Stamp, and the seedman at the cotton gin, that is West Stamps. Her crisp meat pies and cool lemonade, when joined to her miraculous ability to be in two places at the same time, assured her business a success. From being a mobile lunch counter, she set up a stand between the 2 points of fiasco interest and supplied the workers' needs for a few years. Then she had the store built in the heart of the black area. Over the years, it became the lay center of activities in towns. On Saturdays, barbers sat their customers in the shade on the porch of the store, and on their sea-list crawling through the south leaned across its benches and sang their sad songs of the Brazos while they played juice, harps, and cigar box guitars. The former name of the store was the Wim Johnson General Merchandise Store. Customers could find food stamps and a good variety of colored thread, mash for hogs, corn for chicken, coil oil for lamps, light bulbs for the wealthy, shoestrings, hairdressing, balloons, flower seeds. Anything not visible had only to be ordered. until we became familiar enough to belong to the store, and it to us, we were looked up in a fun house of things, where the attendant had gone home for life. Each year I watched the field across the store turn caterpillar green, then gradually frosty white. I knew exactly how long it would be before the big wagons would pull into the front yard and load on the cotton pickers at daybreak to carry them to the remaining of slavery plantations. During the picking season, my grandmother would get up out of bed at 4 o'clock in the morning and creak down to her knees and chant in a sleep filled voice, "Our Father, thank you for letting me see this new day. Thank you that you didn't allow the bed I lay on last night to be my cooling board, nor my blanket, my winding sheets. Guide my feet this day along the straight and narrow, and help me to put a bridle on my tongue. Bless this house and everything in it. Thank you in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen." Before she had quite arisen, she called our names, issued orders, and pushed her large feet into the homemade slippers across the bare light washwood floor to light the coal oil lamp. The light lamp in the store gave a soft make-believe in our world, which made me want to whisper and walk about on tippy-toe. The order of onions and oranges had been mixing all night and wouldn't be dispersed until the wooden slat was removed from the door. In the early morning, air forced its way in with the bodies of the people who had walked miles to reach the pickup place. "Sister, I'll have 2 cans of sardines. I'm going to work so fast today. I'm going to make you look like you're standing still. Let me have a hunk of cheese, some salty crackers. Just give me a couple of them fat peanut paddles." That would be from a picker who was taking his lunch. The greasy brown bag sack was stuck behind the bib of his overalls. He used the candy as a snack before the noon sun called the workers to rest. In those tender mornings, the store was full of laughter, joking, boosting, and bragging. One man was going to pick 200 pounds of cotton and another 300. Even the children were promising to bring home 4 bits and 6 bits. The champion picker of the day before was the hero of dawn. If he prophesied that the cotton in today's field was going to be spared and stick to the boils like glue, every listener would grunt a hearty agreement. The sound of the empty cotton sacks dragging over the floor and the murmurs of wakened people were sliced by the cash register as we rung up the 5-cent sales. If the morning sounds and smells were touched with the supernatural, the late afternoon had all the features of the normal Arkansas life. In the dying sunlight, the people dragged rather than their empty cotton sacks, brought back to the store. The pickers would step out of the backs of the trucks and fall down, dirt disappointed, to the ground. No matter how much they had picked, it wasn't enough. Their wages wouldn't even get them out of debt. To my grandmother. Not to mention the staggering bill that waited on them at the White Commercy downtown. The sound of the new morning had been replaced with grumbles about cheating houses, weighed scales, snakes, skimpy cottons, and dusty roads. In the later years, I was confronted the stereotype picture of gay sing-song cotton pickers, which such enrage that I was told by fellow blacks that my paranoia was embarrassing. But I had seen the finger cuts by the mean little cotton balls, and I had witnessed the backs and shoulders and arms and legs resisting my further demands. Some of the workers would have left their sacks at the store to be picked up the following morning, but had a few to take them home for repairs. I went to picture them sewing the coarse material under a coal oil lamp with fingers stiffened from the day's work. In too few hours, they would have walked back to Sister Henderson's store, get vitals and load again onto the store. Then they would face another day of trying to earn enough for the whole year, with the heavy knowledge that they were going to end the season as they started it, without the money or credit necessary to sustain a family for 3 months in cotton picking time. The late afternoons revealed the harshness of black southern life, which in the early morning had been softened by nature's blessings of grogginess, forgetfulness, and the soft lamp light. Chapter 2. While Bailey was 6 and I was a year younger, we used to rattle off the times tables with the speed I was later to see Chinese children in San Francisco employed on their abacuses. Our summer gray pot bellied stove bloomed rosy red during the winter and became a serve disciplinary threat. But if we were so foolish as to indulge in making mistakes, Uncle Willie used to sit like a giant black Z and hear us testify to the Lafayette Country Training School's abilities. His face pulled down on the left side as if a pulley had been attached to his lower teeth, and left his hand was only a mite bigger than Bailey's. But on the second mistake, or on the third hesitation, his big, overgrown right hand would catch one of us behind the collar, and in the same moment would thrust the crippet towards the dull red heater, which throbbed like a devil's toothache. We were never burnt, although once I might have been when I was so terrified I tried to jump onto the stove to remove the possibilities of its remaining a threat. Like most children, I thought if I could face the worst dangerous voluntary in triumph, I would forever have power over it. But in my case of sacrificial effort, I was thought. Uncle Willie held tight to my dress, and I only got close enough to smell the clean, dry scent of hot iron. We learned the times tables without understanding their grand principles, simply because we had the capacity and no alternatives. The tragedy of lameness seems so unfair to children that they are embarrassed in its presence, and they most recently of nature's mold sense that they have only narrowly missed being another of her jokes. In relief at the narrow escape, they vent their emotions in impatience and criticism of unlucky crippled. Mama related times without end and without any show of emotions, how Uncle Willie had been dropped when he was 3 years old by a woman who was minding him. She seems to hold on rancor against the babysitters, nor for her just God who allowed the incident. She felt it necessary to explain over and over again to those who knew the story by heart that he wasn't born that way. In our society, where two-legged, two-armed, strong black men were able at the best to eke out only the necessities of life, Uncle Willie, with his starched shirts, shined shoes, and shelves full of food, was the whipping boy and butt of jokes of the underemployed and underpaid. Fate not only disabled him, but laid a double-tired barrier in his life. He was also proud and sensitive. Therefore, he couldn't pretend that he wasn't crippled, nor he couldn't deceive himself that people were not repelled by his defect. Only once in all the years of trying not to watch him I saw him pretend to himself and others that he wasn't lame. Coming home from school one day, I saw a dark car in the front yard. I rushed in to find a strange man and a woman drinking Dr. Pepper in the cool of the store. I sensed a wrongness around me, like an alarm that had not gone off without being set. I knew it couldn't be the strangers, not frequently, but often enough. Travelers pulled off the main road to buy tobacco or soft drinks in the only black store in Stamps. When I looked at Uncle Willie, I knew what was pulling my mind's cocktails. He was standing erect behind the counter, not leaning forward or resting on the small shelf that had been built for him. His eye seems to hold me with a mixture of threats and appeal. I greeted the strangers and rolled my eyes around for his walking stick. It was nowhere to be seen. He said, my niece. She's just come from school." Then to the couple, "You know how children are these days. They play all day at school and can't wait to get home and play some more." The people smiled, very friendly. He added, "Go on out and play, sister." The lady laughed in a soft Arkansas voice and said, "Well, you know, Mr. Johnson, they say you're only a child once. Have you have any children of your own?" Uncle Willie looked at me with an impatience I hadn't seen in his face, even when he took 30 minutes to loop the lace over his high top shoes. "I thought I told you to go outside and play." Before I left, I saw him lean on the shelves of Garnet snuff, Prince Albert, and spark plug chewing tobacco. "No, ma'am, no children, no wife." He tried to laugh. "I have an old mother and my brother's 2 children to look after." I didn't mind him using us to make himself look good. In fact, I would have pretended to be his daughter if he wanted me to. Not only did I not feel any loyalty to my father, I figured that if I had been Uncle Willie's child, I would have received much better treatment. The couple left after a few minutes, and from the back of the house, I watched the red car scare chickens, raise dust, and disappear towards Magnolia. Uncle Willie was making his way down the long shaded aisle between the shelves and the counter, hand over hand, like a man climbing out of a dream. I stayed quiet and watched him lurch from one side, bumping into the other, until he reached the coal oil tank. He put his hands behind the dark recess and took his cane in the strong fist and shifted his weight on the wooden support. He thought he had pulled it off. I never know why it was important to him that the couple would take a picture of a whole Mr. Johnson back to the Little Rock. He must have tried of being crippled as a prisoner, tired of the penitentiary bars and the guilty tire of blame. The high-topped shoes and the cane, his uncontrollable muscles and thick tongue, and the looks he suffered of either contempt or pity had simply worn him out. And for one part of an afternoon, he wanted no part of them. I understand and felt closer to him at the moment than ever before or since. During these years in Stamps, I met and fell in love with William Shakespeare. He was my first white love, although I enjoyed and respected Kipling, Poe, Butler, Thackeray, and Henley. I saved my young and loyal passion for Paul Laurence Dunbar, Langston Hughes, James Weldon Johnson, and W.E.B. Du Bois. Lately at Atlanta, but it was Shakespeare who said, "When in disgrace with fortune, man's eyes," it was a state with which I felt myself most familiar. I pacify myself about his whiteness by saying that after all he had been dead so long it couldn't matter to anyone anymore. Bailey and I decided to memorize a scene from the Merit, Merit of Venus, but we realized that Mama would question us about the author and that we would have to tell her that Shakespeare was white and wouldn't matter to her whether he was dead or not. So we chose The Creation by James Weldon Johnson instead. Chapter 3. Weighing the half-pounds of flour, excluding the scoop and depositing them dust-free into the thin paper sacks, held a simple kind of adventure for me. I developed an eye for measuring how full silver-looking ladder of flour, mash, meal, sugar, or corn had to be pushed, the scales indicating over to 8 ounces or 1 pound. When I was absolutely accurate, our appreciative customers used to admire. Sister Henderson sure got some smart grandchildren. If I was off in the store's favor, the eagle-eye woman would say, "Put some more in that sack, child. Don't you try to make your profit off of me." Then I would quietly but persistently punish myself for every bad judgment. The fine was no silver-wrapped kisses, the sweet chocolate drops that I love more than anything in the world except Bailey and maybe canned pineapples. My obsession with pineapples nearly drove me mad. I dreamt of the days when I have been grown and able to buy a whole carton for myself alone. Although the syrup golden rings sat in their exotic cans on the shelves year round, we only tasted them during Christmas. Mama used the juice to make almost black fruit cakes. Then she lined heavily encrusted iron skillets with the pineapple rings for which upside down cakes. Bailey and I received 1 slice each. I carried mine around for hours, shredding off the fruit until nothing was left except the perfume on my fingers. I like to think that my desires for pineapples was so scared that I wouldn't allow myself to steal a can and eat it alone out in the garden. But I'm certain that I must have weighed the possibility of the scent exposing me and didn't have the nerve to attempt it. Until I was 13 and left Arkansas for good, the store was my favorite place to be. Alone, empty in the mornings, it looked like an unopened present from a stranger. Opening the front doors was pulling the ribbon off the unexpected gift. The light would come in softly, easing itself over the shelves of mackerel, salmon, tobacco thread. It felt flat on the big vat of lard, and by noontime during the summer, the grease had softened to the thick soup. Whenever I walked into the store in the afternoon, I sensed that it was tired. I alone could hear the slow pulse of its job half done. But just before bedtime, after numerous people have walked in and out, have argued over their bills or joked about their neighbors or just dropped in to give Sister Henderson a hiya, the promised magic mornings returned to the store and spread itself over the family and washed life waves. Mama opened boxes of crispy crackers and we sat around the meat block at the rear of the store. I sliced onions and Bailey opened 2 or even 3 cans of sardines and allowing their juices of oil and fishing boats to ooze down and around the sides. That was supper. In the evening, when we were alone like that, Uncle Willie didn't stutter or shake or even give indication that he had an affliction. It seems that the peace of a day's ending was an assurance that the covenant God made with children, blacks and the cripples, was still in effect. Throwing scoops of corn to the chickens and mixing sour dry mash with leftover food and oily dish, water for the hogs were among or even chores. Bailey and I sloshed down twilight trails to the pig pen, and standing on the first fence, rungs were poured down, an unpeeling concoction to our grateful hogs. They mashed their tender pink snorts down into the slope and rooted and grunted their satisfaction. We always grunted a reply, only half in jest. We were also grateful that we had concluded the dirtiest of chores and had only gotten the evil smelling swells on our shoes, stockings, feet, and hands. Late one day, as we were attending to the pigs, I heard a horse in the front yard and ran to find out who had came riding up on a Thursday, even when Mr. Stewart, the quiet, bitter man who owned a riding horse, would be resting by his fire until the morning called him out over to the fields. The used to be sheriff sat rascally astride his horse. His nonchalance was meant to convene his authority and power over even dumb animals. How much more capable he would be with blacks. It went without saying. His twang jogged in the brittle area. From the side of the store, Bailey and I heard him say to Mama, "Annie, tell Willie he better lay low tonight. A crazy black man messed with a white lady today. Some of the boys I'll be coming over later." Even after the slow drag of years, I remember the sense of fear which filled my mouth with hot, dry air and made my body light. The boys, those cement faces and eyes of hate that burn the clothes off of you. If they happen to see you lounging on the main street downtown Saturday, boys, it seems that youth had never happened to them. Boys, no rather men who were covered with graves, dust, and age without beauty or learning. The ugliness or rottenness of old abomination. If on Judgment Day I was summoned by St. Peter's to give testimony to the used to be sheriff's act of kindness, I would be unable to say anything in his behalf. His confidence that made my uncle, every other black man who heard of the Clangs come and ride, would scurry under their houses. To hide in the chicken droppings was too humiliating to hear. Without waiting for Mama's thanks, he rode out of the yard, sure that things were as they should be, and that he was a gentleman, saving those deserving serfs from the laws of the land which he had condoned. Immediately, while his horse's roofs were still loudly thundering the ground, Mama blew out the coal-out lamps. She had a quiet, hard talk with Uncle Willie and called Bailey and me into the store. We were told to take the potatoes and onions out of their bins and knock out the dividing walls that kept them apart. Then, with a tedious and fearful slowness, Uncle Willie gave me his rubber-tipped cane and bent down to get into the now enlarged empty bin. It took forever before he laid down flat, and then we covered him with the potatoes and onions layer upon layer, like a casserole. Grandmother knelt praying in the darkened store. It was unfortunate that the boys didn't ride into our yard that evening and insisted that Mama open the store. They would have surely found Uncle Willie and just as surely lynched him. He moaned the whole night, through, as if he had in fact been guilty of some heinous crime. The heavy sounds pushed their way out of the blanket of vegetables, and I pictured his mouth pulling down on the right side and his saliva flowing into the eyes of the new potatoes and waiting there like dewdrops from the warmth of the morning. Okay, so chapter 4. What sets out southern towns apart from another, or from a northern town or hamlet or city high-rise? The answer must be the experience shared between the unknowing majority and the knowing minority. All of the childhood's unanswered question must finally be passed back to the town and answered there. Heroes and boogeymen. Values and dislikes are first encountered and labored in that early environment. In later years, they change faces, places, maybe races, tactics, intestines, and goals. But beneath those protectorate masks, they wear forever the stocking cap face of childhood. Mr. McLeroy, who lived in the big rumbling house next to the store, was very tall, broad, and although the years have eaten away the flesh from his shoulders, they had not, at the time of my knowing him, gotten to his high stomach of or his hands or feet. He was the only black I knew, except for the school principal and the visiting teachers who wore matching pants and jackets. When I learned the men's clothes were sold like that and called suits, I remember thinking that somebody had been very bright, for it made man look less manly, less threatening, and a little more like woman. Mr. McElroy never laughed and seldom smiled, and to his credit was the fact that he liked to talk to Uncle Willie. He never went to church, which Bailey and I thought also proved that he was very a courageous person. How great it would be to grow up like that, to be able to stare religion down, especially living next door to a woman like Mama. I watched him with excitement of expecting him to do anything at any time. I never tried of this, or became disappointed or disenchanted with him. Although from the perch of age, I've seen him now as a very simple and undistrustful man who sold patients medicine, tonics to the less sophisticated people in towns surrounding of the stamps. There seemed to be an understanding between Mr. Elroy and grandmother. This was obviously to us because he never chased us off his land. In summer late sunshine, I often sat under the chinaberry tree in his yard, surrounded by bitter aroma of its fruits and lured by the drone or flies that fled on the berries, and sat in the slotted swing on his porch, rocking in his brown three-piece, his white Panama nodding in time with whirl of insects. One greeting a day was all that could be expected from Mr. McElroy, and after his good morning, child, or good afternoon, child, he never said a word, even if I met him again on the road in front of his house, or drawn by the well, or ran into him behind the house, escaping in a game of hide and seek. He remained a mystery in my childhood, a man who owned his land and the big many windows house with a porch that clung to its sides all around the house, an independent black man, and there in the stamps, Bailey was the greatest person in my world. In fact, that he was my brother, my only brother, I had no sisters to share with him, was such a good fortune that it made me want to live a Christian life just to show God that I was grateful. Where I was big, elbowed, and graded, he was small, graceful, and smooth. When I was described by our playmates as being my color, he was laud for his velvet black skin. His hair fell down in black curls, and my head was covered with black steel wool, and yet he loved me. When our elders said unkind things about my features, Bailey would wink at me from across the room, and I knew that it was a matter of time before he would have taken revenge. He would allow the old ladies to finish wondering how earth I came about. Then he would ask in a voice like cooling bacon grease, "Oh, Mrs. Coleman, how is your son? I saw him the other day, and he looks sick enough to die." August, the ladies would ask, "Die? From what? He ain't sick." And in a voice oilier than the one before, he answered with a straight face, "From the uglies." I hold my laugh, bite my tongue, grit my teeth, and very seriously erase even the touch of smile from my face. Later behind the house, by the black walnut tree, we laugh and howl. Bailey could count on very few punishment for his consistently outrageous behavior, for he was the pride of Henderson and Johnson's family. His movements, as he was later to describe those of acquaintance, were activated with oily precision. He was able to find more hours in the day than I thought existed. He finished chores, homework, read more books than I played, and played group names on the side of the hill with the best of them. He could even pray out loud in church, and was amped at stealing pickles from the barrel, and sat under the fruit counter and Uncle Willie's nose. Once, when the store was full of lunchtime customers, he dipped the strainer, which we also used to swift Villy from the meal and flour, into the barrel, fished for 2 fat pickles. He caught them and hooked the strainer onto the side of the barrel, where they dripped until he was ready for them. When the last school bell rang, he picked up the nearly dried pickle out of the strainer, jammed them into his pockets, and threw the strainer behind the oranges. We ran out the store. It was summer and his pants were short, so the pickle juice made clean streams down his ashy legs. And he jumped with his pockets full of loot and his eyes laughing. And how about that? He smelled like vinegar, barrel, and sour angels. After our early chores were done, while Uncle Willie or Mama minded the store, we were free to play children's games as long as we stayed within yelling distance. Playing hide and go seek, his voice was easily identified, singing "Last night, night before, 24 robbers at my door, who all is hid, asked me to let them in, hit them in the head with a rolling pin, who all is hid in the following leader." Naturally, he was the one who created the most darling and interesting thing to do. And when he was on the tail of the Pop the Whip, he would twirl off the end like a top, spinning, falling, laughing, finally stopping just before my heart beat its last, and then he was back in the game, still laughing. After all the needs a lonely child has, the one that must be satisfied if there is going to be hope, and a hope of wholesomeness. It was unshaken need for an unshakable God. My pretty black brother was my kingdom come. In stamps, the custom was to can everything that could possibly be preserved. During the killing season, after the first frost, all neighbors helped each other to slaughter hogs, even the quiet, big-eyed cows, if they had stopped giving milk. The missionary ladies of the Christian Methodist Episcopal Church helped Mama prepare the for sausages. They squeezed their fat arms, elbows deep in the ground. Okay. So, meat, mix it with gray nose-opening sage, pepper, and salt, and made tasty little samples for all obedient children who brought wood for the slick black stove. The man chopped off the large pieces of meat and laid them in the smokehouse to begin the curling process. They opened the knuckles of the hams, which their deadly-looking knives took out a certain round, harmless bone, and rubbed salt, coarse brown salt that looked like fine gravel, into the flesh, and the blood popped to the surface. Throughout the year, until the next frost, we took our meals from the smokehouse, the little garden that laid cousin close to the store, and from the shelves of canned foods. There were choices on the shelves that could set a hungry child's mouth to water. Green beans snapped, always the right length, collards, cabbage, juice, red tomatoes, preserved that came into their own, unstreamed buttered biscuits and sausage, beets, berries, and fruit grown in Arkansas. But at least twice yearly, Mama would feel that as children we should have fresh meat included in our diets. We were given money, pennies, nickels, dimes, entrusted to Bailey and sent to town to buy liver. Since the whites had refrigerators, their butchers bought the meat from commercial slaughterhouse in Texarkana and sold it to the wealthy, even in the peak of summer. Crossing the black area of stamps, which in childhood's narrow measure seems a whole word, we were obligated by the custom to stop and speak to every person we met, and Bailey felt constrained to spend a few minutes playing with each friend. There was a joy in going to the town with money and in our pockets and times on our hands. But the pleasure field when we reached the white part of town after we left Mr. Willie Williams' do drop in, the last stop before White Folksville. We had to cross the pond and adventure the railroad tracks. We were exploring and walking without weapons into man-eating animals territory. In stamps, the segregated was so complete that most black children didn't really absolutely know what white looks like, other than that they were different, to be dreaded, and in that dread was included the hostility of the powerless against the powerful, the poor against the rich, the worker against the work for, and the ragged against the well-dressed. I remember never believing the whites were really real. Many women who worked in their kitchens traded at our store, and when they carried their finished laundry back to the town, they often set big baskets down on our front porch to pull a singular piece from the starch collection and showed their either how graceful was their ironing and how rich or opulent was their property of their employees. I looked at the items that weren't on display. I knew, for instance, that white men wore shorts as Uncle Willie did, and that they had an opening for taking out their things and peeing, and that white women's breasts were built into their dresses, as some people said, because I said their breasts in their baskets, but I couldn't force myself to think of them as people. People were Miss Langrone, Mrs. Hendricks, Mama, Reverend C, Lily B, and Lewis, and Rex. White folks couldn't be people because their feet were too small, their skin too white and see-throughy, and they didn't walk on the balls of their feet the way people did. They walked on their heels like horses. People were those who lived on my side of town. I didn't like them all, or in fact any of them very much, but they were people. These others, the strained pale creatures that lived in their alien unlife, weren't considered folks, they were white folks. Chapter 5. Thou shalt not be dirty, and thou shalt not be imprudent, were the two commands of Grandmothers Henderson upon which hung our total salvation. Each night in the bitterness winter, we were forced to wash faces, arms, necks, legs, and feet before going to bed. She used to add with a smirk that unprofane people can't control when venturing into profanity, and wash as far as possible, then wash possible. We would go to the well and wash in the ice-cold, clear water, grease our legs with the equal cold, stiff Vaseline, then tippy-toe into the house. We whipped the dust from our toes and settled down for schoolwork, cornbread, cobbler, milk, prayers, and bread, always in that order. Mama was famous for pulling the quilts off after we had fallen asleep to examine our feet. If they weren't clean enough for her, she took the switch and woke us up the offender with a few and-place burning reminders. The area around the well at night was dark and slick, and boys told about how snakes loved water, so that anyone who had to draw water at night and then stand there alone and wash knew the mascones and rattles, puff addlers, and bulk constructors were winding their way to the well and would arrive just as the person washing got soap in their eyes. But Mama convinced us that not only was cleanliness next to godliness. Dirtiness was the inventor of misery. The imprudent child was detested by God and ashamed to its parents, and could bring destructures to its house and line. All adults had to be addressed as Mr., Mrs., Miss, auntie, cousin, uncles, Buddha, sister, brother, and a thousand of other appellations indicating familiar relationships and the loneliness of the addressers. Everyone I knew respected these customary laws except for the white children. Some families of power white children lived on Mama's farm land behind the school. Sometimes a gaggle of them came to the store, filling the whole room, chasing out the air, and even changing the well-known scents. The children crawled over the shelves and into the potatoes and onions bins, swaggling all the time in their sharp voices like cigar boxes, guitars. They took liberties in their stores that I would never dare, since Mama told us that the less you say to white folks, the better. Bailey and I would stand solemn quiet in the displaced air. But if one of the playful apparitions got close to us, I pinched it, partly out of anger, frustration, and partly because I didn't believe in its flesh reality. They called my uncle by his first name and ordered him around the store. He, to my crying shame, obeyed them in his limping, dip fashion. My grandmother, too, followed their orders, except she didn't seem to be civil because she anticipated their needs. Here's sugar, Miss Potter, and here's baking powder. You didn't buy soda last month. You'll probably be needing some. Mama also directed her statements to the adults, but sometimes, oh painful sometimes, the grimy, snotty-nosed girls would answer her, "Nah, Anna," to Mama, who owned the land they lived on, who forgot more that they would ever learn. If there was any justice in the world, God should strike them dumb at once. Just give us some extra salty crackers and some more mackerel. At least they never looked in her face, or I never caught them doing so. Nobody with a smidget of training, not even the worst, would look right in the ground person's face. It meant the person was trying to take the words out before they were formed. The dirty little children didn't do that, but they threw their orders around the store like lashes from a cat o' nine tail. When I was around 10 years old, those scuffy children caused me the most painful, confusing experience I had ever had with my grandmother. One summer morning, after I had swept the dirt yard of leaves, spearmint gum wrappers, and Venice sausage labels, I racked the yellow red dirt and made half moons carefully so that the design stood out clearly. Mask-like, I put the rack behind the store and came through the back of the house to find grandmother on the front porch in her big, wide white apron. The apron was so stiff by virtue of starch that it would have stood alone. Mama was admiring the yard, so I joined her. It truly looked like a flat redhead that had been racked with a big tooth comb. Mama didn't say anything, but I knew she liked it. She looked over towards the school principal house to the right at Mr. McElroy. She was hoping one of those community pillars would see the design before the day's business wiped it out. Then she looked upward to the school. My head had swung with her, so at just about the same time we saw a troop of power white kids marching over the hill and down by the side of the school. I looked to Mama for direction. She did an excellent job at sagging from her waist down, but from the waist up she seemed to be pulling for the top of the oak tree across the road. Then she began to hum a hymn, maybe not to moan, but the tune was so slow and the meter so strange that she could have been moaning. She didn't look at me again. When the children reached halfway down the hill, halfway to the store, she said without turning, "Sister, go on inside." I wanted to beg her, "Mama, don't wait for them. Come on inside with me. If they come in the store, you go to the bedroom and let me wait on them. They only frighten me if you're around. Alone, I know how to handle them." But, of course, I couldn't say anything, so I went in and stood behind the screen door. Before the girls got to the porch, I heard their laughter crackling, popping like pine logs in a cooking stove. I suppose my lifelong paranormal was born in these cold, merciless, slow minutes. They came finally to stand on the ground in front of Mama. At first, they pretended seriousness. Then one of them wrapped her right arm in the crook of her left, pushed out her mouth, and started to hum. I realized that she was amping my grandmother. Another said, "Nah, Helen, you ain't standing like her. This here is it." She then lifted her chest, folded her arms, and mocked the strange character that was Annie Henderson. Another laugh. "Now you can't do it. Your mouth ain't pooched out enough. It's like this." I thought about the riffle behind the door, but I knew I'll never be able to hold it straight. And the 410, our sawed-out shotgun, which stayed loaded and was fired every New Year's night, was locked in the trunk, and Uncle Willie had the key on his chain. Though the fly-speck screen door, I could see that the arms of Mama's apron jiggled from the vibration of her humming, but her knees seemed to have locked, as if they were never bending again. She sang down no louder than before, but no softer either, no slower or no faster. The dirt of the girls' cotton dresses continued on their legs, feet, arms, and faces to make them all the piece. Their greasy uncolored hair unhung, uncombed with a grim finality. I kneeled to see them better, to remember them for all time. The tears that had slipped down my dress left unsurprisingly dark spots and made the front yard blurry and even more unreal. The world had taken a deep breath and was having doubts about continuing to revolve. The girls had tried of mocking Mama and turned to other means of allegations. One crossed her eyes, struck her thumbs in both sides of her mouth, and said, "Look here, Annie." Grandmother hummed on the apron strings, trembled. I wanted to throw a handful of black pepper in their faces, to throw lye on them, to scream that they were dirty, scummy Peckerper Woods, but I knew I was clearly imprisoned behind the scenes as an actor outside, were confined to their roles. One of the smaller girls did a kind of puppet dance, while her fellow clowns laughed at her. But the tall one, who was almost a woman, said something very quietly, which I couldn't hear. They all moved backwards from the porch, still watching Mama. For an awful second, I thought they were going to throw a rock at Mama, who seemed to have turned into a stone herself. But the big girl turned her back and bent down and put her hands on flat on the ground. She didn't pick up anything. She simply shifted her weight and did a handstand. Her dirty bare feet and long legs went straight up for the sky. Her dress fell down around her shoulders, and she had on no drawers. The slight public hair made a brown triangle where her legs came together. She hung in the vacuum of that lifeless morning for a few seconds, then wavered and trembled. The other girls clapped her on the back and slapped her hands. Mama changed her song to bread of heaven, Feed me till I want no more. I found that I was praying too. How long could Mama hold out? What new indignity would they think of to subject her to? Would I be able to stay out of it? What would Mama really like me to do? Then they would be moving out the yard on their way out of town. They bobbed their heads and shook their slacks behind and turned one at a time. Bye, Annie, bye, Annie, bye, Annie. Mama never turned her head or unfolded her arms, but she stopped singing and said, bye, Miss Helen, bye, Miss Ruth, bye, Miss Elios. I burst a firecracker. July the 4th burst. How could Mama call them Ms.? The mean, nasty things. Why couldn't she have come inside the sweet, cool store when we saw them breasting the heel? What did she prove? And then, if they were dirty, mean, impudent, why did Mama have to call them Ms.? She stood another whole song through and then opened the screen door to look down on me crying in rage. She looked until I looked up. Her face was brown moon that shone on me. She was beautiful. Something had happened out there which I couldn't completely understand, but I could see that she was happy. Then she bent down and touched me as a mother of the church laid hands on the sick and afflicted, and I quieted. Go wash your face, sister. And she went behind the candy counter and humbled. Glory, glory, hallelujah. When I lay my burden down, I threw the well water on my face and used the weekday handkerchief to blow my nose. Whatever the contest had been out front, I knew Mama had won. I took the rack back to the front yard. The smudged footprints were easy to erase. I worked for a long time on my new design and laid the rack behind the wash pot. When I came back in the store, I took Mama's hand and we both walked outside to look at the pattern. It was a large heart with lots of hearts, growing smaller inside and piercing from the outside rims to the smallest heart was an arrow. Mama said, sister, that's right, pretty. Then turned back to the store and resumed, glory, 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 hallelujah, when I lay my burden down. Chapter 6. Chapter 6 now. Reverend Howard Thomas was the presiding elder of the district in Arkansas that included Stamps. Every 3 months he visited our church and stayed at Mama's over the Saturday night and preached a loud, passionate sermon on Sunday. He collected the money that had been given in or over the preceding months, heard reports from all the church groups, and shook his hand with adults and kissed all small children. Then he went away. Bailey and I hated him unreservedly. He was ugly, fat, and he laughed like a hog with the colic. We were able to make each other burst with giggling when we immediately of the thick-skinned preacher. Bailey was especially good at it. He could intimidate Reverend Thomas right in front of Uncle Willie and never get caught because he did it soundlessly. He poofed out his cheeks until they looked like wet brown stones and wobbled his head from side to side. Only he knew and I knew it. But that was old Reverend Thomas to a T. His obesity, while disgusting, was not enough to incur the intense hate that we felt for him. The fact that he never bothered to remember our names was insulting, but either was that slight alone enough to make us despite him. But the crime that tipped the scale and made our hate not only just imperative was his actions at the dinner table. He ate the biggest, brownest, and best parts of the chicken at every Sunday meal. The only good thing about his visits was the fact that he always arrived late, on Saturday nights. After we had dinner, I often wondered if he tried to catch us at the table. I believe so, for when he reached the front porch, his little eyes were glittering towards the empty dining room, and his face would fall with disappointment. Then immediately a thin curtain would fall over his features, and he'll laugh, a few bark. Sister Henderson, just like a penny with a hole in it, I've always turned up. Right on cue every time. Mama would answer, "That's right, Elder Thomas. Thank the blessed Jesus. Come right in." He stepped in the front door, and I put down his Gladstone and looked around for Bailey and me. Then he opened his awful arms and groaned, "Suffered little children to come unto me, for such is the kingdom come of heaven." Bailey went to him, and each time with his hand stretched out, ready for a manly shake, but Reverend Thomas would push away the hand and encircled my brother for a few seconds. "You still a boy, buddy. Remember that. They tell me the good books say, when I was a child, I spake as a child. I thought as a child, but when I became a man, I put away childish things." Only then would he open his arms and release Bailey. I never had the nerve to go up to him. I was quite afraid that if I tried to say hello, Reverend Thomas, I would choke on the sins of mocking him. After all, the Bible did say, God is not mocked, and the man was God's representative. He used to say to me, "Come on, little sister, come on and get this blessing." But I was so afraid, and I also hated him so much that my emotions mixed themselves up, and it was enough to start me crying. Mama told him time after time, "Don't pay her no mind, Elder Thomas. You know how tender-hearted she is." He ate the leftovers from our dinner, and he and Uncle Willie discussed the developments of the church programs. They talked about how the present minister was attending to his flock, who got married, who died, and how many children have been born since his last visit. Bailey and I stood like shadows in the rear of the store, near the Coke oil tank, waiting for the juicy parts. But when they were ready to talk about the latest scandal, Mama sent us to her bedroom with warning to have our Sunday school lessons perfectly memorized, or when we knew what we could expect. We had a system that never failed. I would sit in the big rocking chair by the stove and rocking occasionally and stamp my feet. I changed voices, now soft and girly, and then a little deeper like Bailey's. Meanwhile, he would creep back into the store many times. He came flying back to sit on the bed and hold the open lessons book just before Mama suddenly filled the doorway. "You children get your lessons good now? You know all the other children's look up to you all." Then, as she turned back into the store, Bailey followed right on her footsteps to crouch in the shadows and listen for the forbidden gossip. Once he heard how Mr. Coley Washington had a girl from Louisville staying in his house. I didn't think that was so bad, but Bailey explained that Mr. Washington was probably doing it to her. He said that although it was bad just because about everybody in the world did it to somebody, but nobody else was supposed to know that. And once we found out about a man who had been killed by white folks and thrown into the pond. Bailey said that the man's things had been cut off and put in his pocket, and he had been shot in the head, all because the white folks said he did it to a white woman. Because of the kinds of news we hear from those harsh conversations, I was convinced that whenever Reverend Thomas came and Mama sent us to the back of the room, they were going to discuss white folks and doing it, two subjects about which I was very dim. On Sunday mornings, Mama served breakfast that was geared to hold us quite from 9:30 to 3 p.m. She fried thick pink slabs of home curled ham, poured the grease over the sliced red tomatoes, eggs over easy, fried potatoes and onions, yellow mustard, crisp French fried, so hard we would pop them in our mouths and chew bones, fins, and all. Her cat head biscuits were at least 3 inches in diameter and 2 inches thick. The trick to eating catch heads was to get the butter on them before they got cold, then they were delicious. When unluckily they were allowed to get cold, they tended to a gooiness not unlike a wad of tired gum. We were able to reaffirm our findings on the cat heads each Sunday that Reverend Thomas spent with us. Naturally enough, he was asked to bless the table. We would all stand. My uncle, leaning his walking stick against the wall, would lean his weight on the table. Then Reverend Thomas would begin, "Bless Father, we thank you this morning," and on and on and on. I'll stop listening after a while until Bailey kicked me, and then I cracked my lids to see what had promised to be a meal that would make any Sunday proud. But as the Reverend droned on and on to a God who I thought must be bored to hear the same things over and over again, I saw that the ham grease had turned white on the tomatoes. The eggs had withdrawn from the edge of the platter to bunch in the center like children left out in the cold, and the catch head had sat down on themselves with the conclusiveness of a fat woman sitting in an easy chair. And still he talked on. When he finally stopped, our appetites were gone, but he feasted on the cold food with a non-talking but still noisy relish. In the Christian Methodist Church, the children's section was on the right, catered corner from the pew that hold those anonymous women called the mothers of the church. In the young people section, the benches were placed close together, and when a child's legs no longer comfortably fit in the narrow space, it was an indication to the elders that the person could now move into the intimate area, which is the center of the church. Bailey and I were allowed to sit with other children, and only when there were informed meetings, church socials, or like that. But on the Sundays when Reverend Thomas preached, it was ordained that we occupy the first row, called the mourner's bench. I thought we were placed in the front because Mama was proud of us, but Bailey assured me that she just wanted to keep her grandchildren under the thumb and eye. Reverend Thomas took his next text from the Deuteronomy, and I was stretched between the loafing his voice and wanting to listen to the sermon. Deuteronomy was my favorite book in the Bible. The laws were so absolute and so clearly set down that I knew if a person truly wanted to avoid hell and brimstone and being roasted forever in the devil's fire, all she had to do was memorize Deuteronomy and follow its teaching, word for word. I also liked the way the word rolled off the tongue. Bailey and I sat alone on the front bench, the wooden slats pressing hard on our behinds and the backs of our thighs. I would have wiggled just a bit, but each time I looked over at Mama, she seemed to threaten, "Move, and I'll tear you up," so obedient to unvoiced command. And I sat. The church ladies were warming up behind me with a few hallelujahs and praise the Lords and amens, and the preacher hadn't really moved into the meat of the sermon. It was going to be a hot service. On my way into church, I saw Sister Monroe, her open face, golden crown, glistened when she opened her mouth to return a neighborly greeting. She lived in the country and couldn't get to church every Sunday, so she made up for her absences by shouting so hard when she did make it that she shook the whole church. As soon as she took her seat, all the ushers would move her to the side of the church because it took 3 women and sometimes a man or two to hold her. Once, when she hadn't been to church for a few months, she got the spirit and started shouting, throwing her hands around and jerking her body so that the ushers went over to hold her down. But she tore herself away from them and ran up to the pulpit. She stood in front of the altar, shaking like a freshly caught trout. She screamed at Reverend Taylor, "Preach it!" I said, "Preach it." Naturally, he kept on preaching as if she wasn't standing there telling him what to do. Then she screamed and extremely fierce. I said, "Preach it," and stepped onto the altar. Then Reverend kept on throwing out phrases like home run balls, and Sister Monroe made a quick break and grasped for him. For just a second, everything and everyone in the church, except Reverend Taylor and Sister Monroe, hung loose like stockings on a wash line. Then caught the minister by the sleeves of his jacket and his coat tail. Then she rocked him from side to side. I have to say this for our minister. He never stopped giving us the lesson. The usher board made its way to the pulpit, going up both aisles with a little more haste than it's customarily seen in church. Truth to tell, they fairly ran into the minister's aid. Then 2 of the deacons, in their shiny Sunday suits, joined the ladies in white on the pulpit, and each time they prayed Sister Monroe loose from the preacher. He took another deep breath and kept on preaching, and Sister Monroe grabbed him in another place, and more firmly. Reverend Taylor was helping his rescuers as much as possible by jumping around when he got a chance. His voice at one point got so low it sounded like a roll of thunder. Then Sister Monroe's "Preach It" cut through the roar, and we all wondered if it would ever end. Would they go on forever or get tired out at last, like a game of blindsman bluff that lasted too long, with nobody caring who was it? I'll never know what might have happened, because magically the pandemonium spread. The spirit-infused Deacon Jackson and Sister Wilson, the chairman of the usher board, at the same time. Deacon Jackson, a tall, thin, quiet man who was also a part-time Sunday school teacher, gave a scream like a fallen tree, leaned back on a thin air, and punched Reverend Taylor on the arm. It must have hurt as much as it got caught, that the Reverend unaware. There was a moment's break in the rolling sound, and Reverend Taylor jerked around, surprised, and hauled off, punched Deacon Jackson. In the same second, Sister Wilson caught his ties, looped it over in her fist a few times, and pressed down on him. There wasn't time to laugh or cry before all 3 of them were down on the floor behind the altar. Their legs spiked out like kindling wood. Sister Monroe, who had been the cause of all the excitement, walking off the dais, cool, spent, and raised her flinty voice in the hymn, "I came to Jesus as I was, worried, worn, and sad. I found in him a resting place, and he has made me glad." The minister took advantage of already being on the floor and asked in a choky little voice if the church would kneel with him to offer a prayer of thanksgiving. He said we had been visited with a mighty spirit, and let the whole church say amen. On the next Sunday, he took his text from the 18th chapter of the Gospel according to St. Luke, and talked quietly but seriously about the Pharisees who prayed in the streets so that the public would be impressed with their religion devotion. I doubt that anyone got the message, certainly not those to whom it was directed. The deacon board, however, did appropriate funds for him to buy a new suit. The other was a total loss. Our presiding elder had heard the story of Reverend Taylor and Sister Monroe, but I was sure he didn't know her by sight. So my interest in the service potentially and my aversions to Reverend Thomas caused me to turn him off. Turning off or turning out people was my highly developed art. The custom of letting obedient children be seen but not heard was so agreeable to me that I went one step further. Obedient children should not see or heard if they choose not to do so. I laid a handful of tension on my face and turned up the sounds in the church. Sister Monroe's fuse was already lit and she sizzled somewhere to the right behind me. Elder Thomas jumped into the sermon, determined, I suppose, to give them members what they came for. I saw the ushers from the left side of the church near the big windows begin to move discreetly like pallbearers towards Sister Monroe's bench. Bailey jogged my knee when the incident with Sister Monroe, which we always called simply the incident, had taken place. We had been too astounded to laugh, but for weeks after all we needed to send us into a violent outburst of laughter was a whisper, preach it. Anyway, he pushed my knee, covered his mouth, and whispered, say, preach it. I looked towards Mama across the square of the strain boards over the collection table, hoping that a look from her would root me safely to my sanity. But the first time in memory, Mama was staring behind me at Sister Monroe. I suppose that she was counting on bringing that emotional lady up short with a served look or two. But Sister Monroe's voice had already reached the danger point. Preach it. There were a few smothered giggles from the children's section, and Bailey nudged me again. I say, preach it, in a whisper. Sister Monroe echoed him loudly. I said, preach it. Two deacons welled themselves and around Brother Jackson as a prevention measures, and two large, determined-looking men walking down the aisle towards Sister Monroe. While the sounds in the church were increasing, elderly Thomas made the regrettable mistake of increasing his volume too. Then suddenly, like a summer rain, Sister Monroe broke through the clouds of the people trying to hem her in and flooded up to the pulpit. She didn't stop this time, but continued immediately to the altar, bound for Elder Thomas, crying, I said, preach it. Bailey said out loud, hot dog and damn, and she's going to beat his butt. But Reverend Thomas didn't intend to wait for that eventually, so as Sister Monroe approached the pulpit from the right, he started descending from the left. He was not intimidated by his change of venue. He continued preaching and moving. He finally stopped right in front of the collection table, which put him almost in our laps, and Sister Monroe rounded the altar on his heels, followed by the deacons, ushers, and some unofficial members, and a few the bigger children. Just as the elder opened his mouth, pink tongue wavering, and say, Great God of Mount Nebo, Sister Monroe hit him on the back of his head with her purse twice. Before he could bring his lips together, his teeth fell. No, actually, his teeth jumped out of his mouth. The grinning uppers and lowers laid by my right foot, looking empty, at the same time appearing to contain all the emptiness in the world. I could have stretched out a foot and kicked them under the bench or behind the collection table. Sister Monroe was struggling with his coat, and the man had all but picked her up to remove her from the building. Bailey pinched me and said without moving his lips, I'd like to see him eating dinner now. I looked at Reverend Thomas desperately. If he appeared just a little sad or embarrassed, I could feel sorry for him. I wouldn't be able to laugh. My sympathy for him would keep me from laughing. I dreaded laughing in church. If I lost control, two things were certain to happen. I would surely pee and just as surely get a whipping, and this time I would probably die because everything was funny. Sister Monroe and Mama trying to keep her quiet with those threatening looks, and Bailey whispering, preaching, and elderly Thomas with his lips flapping loose like tired elastics. But Reverend Thomas shrugged off Sister Monroe's weakened clutch, pulled out an extra large white-handed handkerchief and spread it over his nasty little teeth, putting them back in his pocket. He gummed, I came into the world naked and I shall go out. Bailey's laugh had worked its way up through his body and was escaping through his nose and his short horse snots. I didn't try any longer to hold back the laugh. I just opened my mouth and released sound. I heard the first gitter jump up in the air over my head, over the pulpit, out the window. Mama said out loud, Sister, but the bench was greasy and I slid off onto the floor. There was more laughter in me trying to get out. I didn't know there was that much in the whole world. It pressed at all my body openings, forcing everything in its path. I cried, hollered, passed gas and urine. I didn't see Bailey descended to the floor, but I rolled over. Once he was kicking and screaming too. Each time we looked at each other, we hollered louder than before, and though he tried to say something, the laughter attacked him, and he was only able to get out, I say, preach. And then I hollered over onto Uncle Willie's rubber-tipped cane. My eyes followed the cane up to his good brown hand on the curve, and up the long, long white sleeve to his face. The one side pulled down as it usually did when he cried. He shuddered. I'm going to whip you this time myself. I have no memory of how we got out of church into the passengers next door, but that overstuffed parlor, Bailey and I received the whipping of our lives. Uncle Willie ordered us between the licks to stop crying. I tried to, but Bailey refused to cooperate. Lately, he explained that when a person is beating you, you should scream as loud as possible. Maybe the whipper will become embarrassed, or else some sympathetic soul might come to rescue you. Our Savior came for either of these reasons, but because Bailey yelled so loud and disrupted what was left of the service, the minister's wife came out and asked Uncle Willie to quiet us down. Laughter so easily turned to hysteria for imaginary children. I felt for weeks after that I had been very, very sick, and until I completely recovered my strength, I stood on the laughter's cliff, and any funny thing could hurl me off to my death far below. Each time Bailey said, preach it to me, I hit him as hard as I could and cried. Chapter 7. Mama had married 3 times. Mr. Johnson, my grandfather, who left her around the turn of the century with 2 small sons to raise. Mr. Henderson, of whom I know nothing at all. Then finally, Mr. Murphy. I saw him fleeting once. He came through stamps on Saturday night, and grandmother gave me the chore of making his pallet on the floor. He was a stocky, dark man who wore a snap-brim hat like George Raff. The next morning, he hung around the store until we returned from church. That marked the first Sunday I knew Uncle Willie to miss service. Bailey said he stayed home to keep Mr. Murray from stealing us blind. He left in the middle of the afternoon after one of Mama's extensive Sunday dinners. His hat pushed back off his forehead. He walked down the road whistling. I watched his thick back until he turned the bend by the big by the big white church. People spoke of Mama as good-looking woman, and some who remembered her youth said she used to be right pretty. I saw only her power and strength. She was taller than any woman in my personal world, and her hands were so large they could span my forehead from ear to ear. Her voice was so soft, only because she chose to keep it so. In church, when she was called upon to sing, she seemed to pull out plugs from behind her jaws, and the huge, almost rug sound would pour over the listener and throb in the ear. Each Sunday, after she had taken her seat, the minister would announce, "We will now be led in a hymn by Sister Henderson." And each Sunday she looked up with amazement at the preacher and asked silently, "Me?" After a second of assuring herself that she indeed was being called upon, she laid down her handbag and slowly folded her handkerchief. This was placed neatly on the top of her purse. Then she leaned on the bench in front of pushed herself to a standing position, and then she opened her mouth. And the song jumped out as if it had only been waiting for the right time to make an appearance, week after week and year after year. Performance every change. Yet I don't remember anyone's ever remarking on her sincerely or readiness to sing. Mama intended to teach Bailey and me to use the path of life that she and her generation and all the blacks gone before had found and found to be safe ones. She didn't cotton to the idea that white folks could be talked to at all without risking one's life, and certainly they couldn't be spoken to insolently. In fact, even in their absence, they could not be spoken of too harshly unless we used to sobrant they. If they had been asked and had chosen to answer the question of whether she was cowardly or not, she would have said that she was a realist. Didn't she stand up to them year after year? Wasn't she the only black woman in Stamps referred to once as Miss? That incident became one of Stamp's little legends some years before Bailey and I arrived in town. A man was hunted down for assaulting white womanhood, and trying to escape, he ran to the store. Mama and Uncle Willie hid him behind the chifforobe until night, gave him supplies for an overland journey, and sent him on his way. He was, however, apprehended, and in court, when he was questioned as to his movements on the day of the crime, he replied that after he heard that he was being sought, he took refuge in Mrs. Henderson's store. The judge asked that Mrs. Henderson be sub-opened, and when Mama arrived and said she was Mrs. Henderson's son, the judge, the bailiff, and other whites in the audience laughed. The judge had really made a gaffe calling a black woman Miss, but then he was from Pine Bluff. Couldn't have been expected to have known that a woman who owned a store in that village would also turn out to be colored. The whites tickled their funny bones with the incident for a long time, and the blacks thought it proved the worth and majestically of my grandmother. Okay, that was from chapter 1 to chapter 6, Maya Angelou, I Know Why the Cage Bird Sings. So that is the end of the live. The next live will read from chapter 8 to the next couple of chapters. Thank you for watching. Make sure you follow. Thank you.